Good morning and welcome to the forum at All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm Spencer Graves. I'm a member of the Forum Committee. This forum is a platform for the discussion of significant issues, especially those involving ethical values in the contemporary world. It has been doing this since 1943. Descriptions of most of these forums since 2012 are searchable at kkfi.org, and podcasts are available for most of those. This program is live streamed on YouTube. If you log into YouTube, you can post questions in the chat, which will be asked of the speaker on your behalf, time permitting. People in the room with me are asked to silence your cell phones. Our guest today is Susan Shirk, who will discuss how China derailed its peaceful rise to power. Shirk is a research professor at the University of California, San Diego, founding chair of their 21st Century China Center, and director emeritus of the University of California Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. She previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs in the Clinton administration. Her book on Overreach, How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise, appeared in 2022. And she just returned from China, so she can give us an update. She was recommended to us by John Mueller, who discussed the stupidity of war and the exaggeration of threats 52 weeks ago for us. Mueller said that the most important thing the United States did to win the Cold War was nothing. Between the fall of Saigon in 1975 and the inauguration of Ronald Reagan as president in 1981, the U.S. fell into a non-interventionist funk as the Soviet Union gathered economic basket cases it could not support and invaded Afghanistan, where it bled to death. I found Shirk's Overreach book frightening in describing how Xi Jinping, the head of state of China, has pushed out or jailed on corruption charges virtually any Chinese leader who might say things that Xi does not like. Um, um, he has convinced himself that since China outperformed the West during the 2008 Great Recession, his socialism with Chinese characteristics is clearly superior. He has built a large military, threatening his neighbors from South Korea to India, including threatening to take Taiwan by force. This last week in this forum, Richard Ned LeBeau told us that U.S. actions to deter aggression by China and others have often provoked the behavior they were intended to deter. And I trust that Professor Shirk will kindly correct any errors or problems of emphasis in this inadequate introduction by this mediocre student of her work, and update us on how her thinking has evolved since she finished that book. She will talk for about 30 minutes, after which we will collect donations from the audience and then have time for questions. Professor Shirk?
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning. Thanks for inviting me. I wrote my book, Overreach, because I'm an old China hand who has been studying China for a very long time, since the 1960s. I first went to China in 1971. And for most of this period after Mao left from the scene, China and the United States managed to get together to get along pretty well. And inside China, people's lives were improving once the Chinese leadership, led by Deng Xiaoping, introduced market competition, opened up China to the world after its long period of self-isolation, and gave the Chinese people the incentive and the opportunity to improve their life situation. So for most of the time I have been studying China, it was a pretty positive experience, positive story about progress. But then in the mid 2000s, around 2006, 7, 8, I saw a market shift in Chinese foreign and domestic policy. And this is what I call overreach. Overreach, of course, means to take things too far, to do them in an exaggerated way, in a manner that snaps back to harm yourself. Overreach is self defeating actions that are harmful to yourself. So I was surprised and worried about this shift in Chinese policy. And I think what people who've read my book, Overreach, find most interesting about it and surprising about it is that this began way before Xi Jinping was in power. So it was in a period in which China was led by Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, and they ruled with a kind of collective leadership. That Hu himself was a relatively weak leader, and all of the other members of the standing committee of the Politburo, they were responsible, each of them was responsible for his own domain, and they took exaggerated threats, foreign threats, domestic threats, and took things too far. So let me talk about some of the ways in which China's policy changed back then. But let me add before I do that, that once Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, China's overreach intensified, became even more extreme. And so I understand why people worry about China's behavior now. And I myself worry about that, although I might be a little bit less worried than some other people because I recognize that there are actually a lot of differences of points of view inside China. Not everybody thinks the same way as Xi Jinping. The problem is that the system leads him to overreach based on what someone in China recently described to me with understatement as his poor judgment. So let's talk a little bit about how China's behavior changed back around 2006, 7, 8. Then let's talk about how it has become even more worrisome under Xi Jinping. But let's save a little bit of time to talk about what the United States should do about this and how it might best respond to the risks that China presents to us. So first, let me just mention the ways in which China's actions changed back in 2006, 7, 8 under Hu Jintao. This first in foreign policy, what surprised me was that China started confronting other countries, Southeast Asian countries, in the South China Sea. Now, Chinese government had claimed the South China Sea for a very long time, including the little rocks and islets in the South China Sea. But it had not really been that central an issue for the Chinese people or for feelings of nationalism. And they managed to handle these territorial disputes with Vietnam, with the Philippines, other claimants in the South China Sea quite peacefully without any major confrontations. But beginning in 2006, Chinese Coast Guard, its marine surveillance vessels, not necessarily its military, but other civilian maritime cutters started confronting the fishing boats or the undersea drilling of energy by other claimants. And these clashes could have escalated. China also started confronting Chinese naval vessels that sail through the South China Sea, which of course is a very important route for commerce. And our naval vessels sail through there because, according to international law, it's international waters. And so the United States feels perfectly free to sail its vessels, research vessels, surveillance vessels through the South China Sea. But remarkably and surprisingly, China started confronting these vessels in a way that was dangerously provocative. And this really changed perceptions on the part of the United States, on the part of China's neighbors in Southeast Asia, and many other countries about what kind of rising power China was. Because up until then, China had behaved in a pretty low-key, reassuring manner. Because Deng Xiaoping, the leader of China, and as well as his successors, had recognized that as China grew more powerful economically and militarily, that other countries would start to see it as a threat. And therefore, they tried to reassure other countries about their intentions by not confronting other countries and by using reassuring rhetoric and integrating the Chinese economy with the economy of its neighbors. China is now the largest trading partner of more than 130 other countries, more than the United States. And so China's large domestic market, its exports, its imports have integrated China with other countries in a way that is basically good for everyone. But in the South China Sea, this new behavior alarmed a lot of people and changed the narrative about what kind of rising power China was. We started to worry that China was maybe not as responsible a rising power as we had hoped, as we had believed. So the other changes in China's actions during this period, 2006, 7, 8, were its domestic practices. Now, of course, China is ruled by a communist country. And so even during this period of reform and opening and reassuring other countries, it was not having elections. It was not a democratic country. But individuals had more ability to choose their jobs, to move, to read some of the information they wanted to learn about the world outside, to read the books they wanted. This was a period of liberalization in China, not democratization. But then, right before the Beijing Olympics, things tightened up a lot. The media tightened up over the media, tightened up over civil society. And at first, I thought the party was just doing this on the eve of the Olympics to make sure there were no surprises, no inadvertent crises that might embarrass it before the Olympics. This does happen in China, where you get this tightening up before major events. But in this case, once they tightened up, they never loosened up ever again. And third, the government, after decentralizing the economy, providing market incentives, allowing more competition, started to return to managing the economy, not quite as tightly as it had under Mao, when China had a centrally planned Soviet style economy. But still, the central government started giving orders, giving direction again. And that also was another form of overreach, which certainly concerned foreign investors and other countries as well. So, this is when overreach began, really under collective leadership in Hu Jintao. What was especially noticeable was that in all these different bureaucratic interest groups that went their own way in an uncoordinated manner, there was a group, the internal police, security police, the propaganda department, led by a leader named Zhou Yongkang, and this is what I call the control coalition, the group of bureaucracies that exaggerates the threat of domestic unrest in order to get bigger budgets, make themselves more influential. And they put a premium on social control, controlling the society. And of course, we see this emphasis on social control growing all the more acute under Xi Jinping today. So that was the situation under collective leadership. But when Hu Jintao voluntarily retired back in 2002, after 2 terms, no, not 2002, sorry, 2012. He came into office in 2002, stepped down voluntarily in 2012, and handed over power to Xi Jinping. So I want to emphasize the fact that before Xi Jinping, and thanks to Deng Xiaoping, China had actually solved the succession problem. It's very difficult for an authoritarian, non-democratic country to achieve peaceful succession of top leadership after fixed terms. And of course, Mao stayed in power from the time the communists took over in 1949 until the time that he died in 1976. But when, after Mao died, China had this remarkable achievement at setting mostly unwritten rules for retirement age and 2 5-year terms in office for the top leadership. And Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao, they voluntarily stepped down after 10 years. And of course, the reason that this peaceful turnover of power is so important is that you get new ideas, you get a kind of check and balance by changing leadership every 10 years. But in the case of Xi Jinping, what he has done now is he revised the Chinese constitution so he can rule indefinitely. He has not identified a successor, and it appears right now he's in his third term. He's already ruled for about 11, 12 years. And it appears that he intends to cling to power for as long as he can, as long as he is healthy. And the change in that rule so that he can stay in power indefinitely has really alarmed many people in China as well as outside China. And he has also, instead of having collective rule of a number of top leaders who potentially can correct one another, he has concentrated power in his own hands and appointed only leaders whom he trusts not to challenge him and who he has worked with closely in the past to surround him. So basically, Xi Jinping is surrounded by a group of yes men today. What's more, Xi Jinping, once he came to power, he claimed a mandate for strongman leadership by saying that he was going to cure the corruption that had become so extreme within the party under collective leadership. And that certainly was the case. One big problem of collective leadership was each one of the top leaders was able to collect a lot of corrupt bribes, rents for himself by controlling the appointments and the projects of officials in his particular cone that he was responsible for. So you had the growth of extreme corruption. Xi Jinping got a mandate to try to fix it, and he carried out a very draconian anti-corruption campaign that resembled a purge because it used anti-corruption to eliminate, put in jail, all the leaders who might potentially challenge him. It involved investigating and going after more than 1 million Chinese Communist Party and government officials, and to go after some very high-level officials, including Zhou Yongkang, who'd been the head of the control coalition under Hu Jintao. Now, this anti-corruption campaign really frightened, terrorized all the subordinate officials in the system who recognized that Xi cared more about loyalty than anything else, including competence. So to prove their loyalty, once they got a hint of what Xi Jinping wanted to do, what his favored policy direction was, they jumped on the bandwagon behind it, endorsing it in an exaggerated way, overreaching in their effort to prove their loyalty to Xi Jinping. And they didn't dare report accurate information up the ladder to Xi Jinping. It was like an emperor who didn't want to hear any bad news. And of course, this dynamic of not revealing accurate information about the costs of his policies to the leader was exactly the problem that China had under Mao Zedong, and that led to the tragedies of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And that's the reason that Deng Xiaoping had replaced it with collective leadership, because he said that the problem under Mao and in many communist authoritarian countries is that you got over concentration of power that led to arbitrary decision making. And tragically, China has returned to that situation under Xi Jinping. And you see the consequences of that overconcentration of power and inability to give accurate feedback to the leader, unwillingness to give accurate feedback to the leader in China's current foreign policy, which is a lot more assertive than it had been even under Hu Jintao. So in the South China Sea, they've built these artificial islands to make their claim to the South China Sea more long-lasting. They confront the other claimants with their Coast Guard and with their military, as well as with American naval vessels. They've become much more active in the East China Sea, where they have a territorial dispute with Japan. And their military has become much more active around Japan. Also with Taiwan, and we want to talk about Taiwan for sure, because that's the one scenario in which we might potentially see an actual military clash with Taiwan, between the mainland and Taiwan, and with the United States and other allies as well. We see that China has imposed military economic sanctions on South Korea, on Australia, when Australia called for an investigation into the origins of COVID. They punished Lithuania, a small country in Eastern Europe, when it invited Taiwan to have a representative office in Lithuania. And China has also, although it formally takes a neutral position on the Russia-Ukraine war, in effect, it's aligned itself with Russia because Xi Jinping sees the world very much the way Putin does. And they both are worried that the West might stir up opposition to them inside their own country, what they call the potential of color revolutions. Of course, domestically, just to finish up internationally, China's rhetoric has also become a lot more bellicose, and its diplomats are now engaged in what they call wolf warrior diplomacy, because they believe that Xi Jinping wants them to talk tougher, stand up for China. And of course, that kind of rhetoric is alienating China from many other countries. Domestically, we've seen a crackdown in Xinjiang on the Muslim Uyghurs. We've seen China cracking down in Hong Kong, violating the commitments it made back in 1997 when Hong Kong reintegrated into the People's Republic of China, crackdown on the private businesses, on civil liberties. So, and of course, the zero COVID policy and the lockdowns were really extreme and showed very poor judgment, and led to the deaths of many people once Xi Jinping suddenly opened up China from the lockdowns once young people started demonstrating back in 2022. So there's been a lot of sudden shifts in leadership, and it's left the Chinese people actually very worried and dissatisfied. The Chinese economy, dramatic growth that you had for 3 decades, has slowed down. Some of that is due to structural issues, but a lot of it is due to mismanagement and incompetence by the Chinese leadership. Foreign investment has plummeted because the foreign companies that used to see tremendous opportunity in manufacturing in China and selling to China, they're now worried about the political risk that Xi Jinping's poor judgment and poor decisions represent, and the crackdown on the private sector. So, what we see is a lot of people in China are really quite worried, and there's a high degree of dissatisfaction in China. So, overreach has harmed China itself. There's no sign that Xi Jinping is asking advice of any other senior leaders, and we are quite uncertain about what the future will hold.
Thank you. Thank you very. Is this mic on? Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Shirk. We will now request donations to cover our costs, and instructions for how to donate online should appear in the chat. Um, Checks can be mailed to All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church at 4501 Walnut Street, Kansas City, Missouri 64111. Please mention the form in the memo line of your check if you'd like. You can also go to allsoulskc.org and search for contribute. Now, if you have a question, please come to the microphone. Line up here on my right, I guess your left. Come to the microphone, speak clearly into the microphone. People watching on YouTube Live should be able to put questions in the chat. One question per person, please, until everyone has had an opportunity to ask a question. And please, no speeches so we can make better use of Professor Shirk's time.
I read a number of years ago that the number one desire in the private, well, semi-private Chinese population was they grow rich and move to San Francisco, California, or Vancouver, British Columbia. That was what number one desire was. The Chinese middle class is larger than the entire population of the United States. Uh, they have they possibly wield some power, but what do you see in Xi Jinping, uh, does he fear them? Does he feel that he must has compromised with them? Does he desire to keep that population unsatisfied?
Great question. Thank you. Well, the Chinese people are leaving China in larger numbers than they ever did before. And there have been many articles, including in the most recent Economist magazine, about this. And of course, the private wealthier people are leaving in larger number, which is very damaging to the Chinese economy to have these very successful, capable people with their investment capital leaving China. There are capital controls, but they figure out ways to evade them. And I dare say that this is a group of people that any country like Canada or Australia or the United States that opens up to them will get a lot of talent. The middle class, if they're able to afford it, it's also, many of them are interested in leaving. What they object to is, of course, they're worried about the economy and unemployment has risen, but they're also worried about the fact that Xi Jinping puts ideology, Marxist ideas, his own ideas ahead of China's economic development. And their children are not learning as much English in school. They're learning a lot more political courses, and they really want their kids to have a good future. So many of them are quite dissatisfied. And what this dissatisfaction leads to, it's very hard to say. So I agree with you. There is a mismatch between the values of the Chinese middle class and Xi Jinping's focus on ideology. Thank you.
Would you discuss the difference between Russia and China in the aspect of business? Is that Putin appears to have Putin Inc. and oligarchy at control of the state, whereas China has private corporations and leaders of those corporations that sometimes are somewhat corrupt. I have known stock in a company, China Brilliance, that was a connection with BMW, and they partnership with them, and then the stock they've manipulated the thing to the point where it's not had no value for a while, and there was notes of corruption. So there seems to be a little bit of a difference. Could you explain? Could you discuss that idea, that the difference between these two countries?
Great. Yes. Well, Russia, Putin is surrounded by a group of a small group of oligarchs who are his cronies. And Russia, of course, Russia's economy is dependent on its energy sector. It has never really fully marketized and developed its manufacturing sector the way China has, and certainly has a lower proportion of its economy is traded. Whereas China did become a very vibrant semi-market economy. As I mentioned, the government still has quite an active role in the economy now, especially under Xi Jinping, because Xi is worried that the United States and other Western developed countries are going to cut it off from trade in technology in particular. So right now, Xi Jinping is focusing on turning China into a high-tech superpower and using the government to do it. But you're right. There are a number of very successful private companies, but Xi Jinping sees the private sector as a threat to him. He thinks these entrepreneurs might all organize to challenge him. So he has put them under quite tight control. It's also true that there has been quite a lot of corruption in the past and going up to the present. The corruption is not just from private business people, it's really the collusion of politicians and business people, because without a strong rule of law, private business people can't protect their assets, can't protect their firms without payoffs to the politicians. So it's different from the Russian system. And the, what it really needs is a legal system which is independent from the Chinese Communist Party.
We have a YouTube question from Michael Hoy. He asks, what role has the rise of wolf warrior diplomacy and the usage of the Ministry of State Security overseas led to the current state of affairs? Is what he said.
Yeah, that's a good question. So this bellicose rhetoric, it's kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? Wolf warrior diplomacy, because diplomats are supposed to be diplomatic and improve relations with the countries where they represent, China. And then the Ministry of State Security has been active overseas as well as internally in China, which of course has violated the laws of many countries overseas. They don't want kind of vigilante justice, so to speak. The Chinese police going after people they say are corrupt, and they want to bring them back to China to put them in prison or try them. But sometimes these are political fights that are not really about corruption. So this has become a big problem in the law enforcement and legal systems between China and other countries. And of course, has further alienated China, led to a backlash against China in other countries.
I wanted to give you a chance to talk about what you think the U.S. government and the U.S. populace at large should do in response to all of this.
Thank you very much. Yes, I ran out of time. Well, I think the most important thing the United States should do is to engage in diplomacy with China, in which we use a combination of carrots and sticks to try to urge China to moderate its policies and to maintain our own strength as a democracy, as an open economy, as a country with a strong legal system, and as a technology power. And what concerns me is that we may be overreacting to the China threat. First of all, let's point out that China has not fought a war with another country since 1979. So when they fought a short war with Vietnam. So this is a big contrast with Russia, which invaded Ukraine and is fighting a brutal war in Ukraine. And its capabilities, even Xi Jinping is not sure of his capabilities, as we see from the fact that he just purged a lot of his top generals, because he is worried that these generals have taken the military budget, which has increased, and put a lot of it into their own pockets rather than using it to improve China's capabilities. So one reason that I think that the risk of a military attack on Taiwan is not as great as many other people believe is because if you've just fired a lot of your top generals, including the Minister of Defense, you, as a leader, you lack confidence in the capabilities of your military. So this is not a time when she is likely to invade Taiwan. So I believe that the United States should engage in effective diplomacy, talk more to China. If you want to use export controls and sanctions on technology to prevent them from strengthening the Chinese military, then we should integrate those sanctions in a strategy of negotiation in which we say to China, look, unless you stop putting military pressure on Japan and your neighbors in the South China Sea, we are prepared to impose technology sanctions on you. Or if you assist Russia in the Ukraine, we are prepared to impose technology sanctions on you. And then let's negotiate with China about those actions and see if we can induce China to moderate its policies. But in terms of maintaining our own competitiveness, one of the most important things is to maintain our openness to talent from China and other countries. And what really worries me is the restrictions that we've put onto students and researchers from China, because these are some of the very talented people who can help us maintain our own competitiveness. What I see is that some of our reaction is kind of making us more like China, and that instead we should become a better version of our open society and economy rather than getting into a race to the bottom with China.
Part about the technology sanctions. My concern, or would you address this issue of rare earth minerals? And China has pretty good control of rare earth minerals throughout the United States. And then recently, there's a company that's trying to build a rare earth mining operation in Nebraska. And would you be concerned that China would be wanting to buy that stock of that company and have ownership of a U.S. company that would be competing with them?
Well, obviously, it's better to have more than less competition. And China does have a lot of mineral resources, including rare earths, silicon for solar panels, a lot of other things. And they've also gone around the world investing in these mineral mines and processing facilities in other parts of the world too. Probably that's something that the United States should be doing more. We probably don't want to have a lot of that mining activity in the United States because it's very environmentally very dirty. Hard to do that kind of mining in an environmentally safe manner. So, however, I don't think that banning Chinese investments in buying land or mining is really the way to go about it. Instead, what we should do is have good environmental regulations for all companies in our own country, and then permit Chinese, if they want to invest in the United States, to follow the same rules that American companies and other companies have to follow.
China is in a crisis. They have pulled in. They have become isolationists. Do you foresee this happening again?
Well, that's obviously a very well-informed question. I don't see them becoming isolationists per se, but it is interesting that the Belt and Road Initiative, in which they have sought to build their economic and political ties with other countries by investing in infrastructure projects throughout the world, linking China by railroad and roads and ports with other countries, has they're starting to reduce the scale of it, because many people in China also object, as you would find in any country. They say, why are you spending this money in other countries? Why not help people in China improve our lot? So what we see is a moderation of the Belt and Road program. But under Xi Jinping, Xi is a very ambitious leader, undoubtedly. He's very proud of China. I don't think he necessarily wants to supplant the United States, but he wants China to be acknowledged as a global power. So I don't think we're in for a period of isolationism quite yet.
I think I saw in your book and elsewhere discussion of the Tiananmen Square protests and comparing how China handled that versus what happened in the 1990s in Russia. Would you care to comment on that?
I think, are we talking about the pro-democracy movement in Russia?
The pro-democracy movement in 1989, I guess it was, and the Tiananmen Square
Right.
protests and so forth and so on, and then the Chinese, from what I understand, the Chinese uh, leadership was very proud of the way that they handled that in comparison to Russia, which, according to some sources, was invaded by an army of economic Chicago school carpetbaggers that basically destroyed the Russian economy for the 1990s. Was only rebuilt when Putin came to power.
Yeah. So of course, in Russia, the communist elite split, and the Soviet Union fell. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union fell, and Russia became, formally speaking, a democracy with elections. That never happened in China. Instead, in 1989, it could have happened. You had protests in more than 130 cities in China over a period of many weeks, more than a month. And the military, only because the military followed orders to put down these demonstrations, finally did the People's Republic of China, the communist regime, survive. So, yeah, of course, the first goal of all Communist Party leaders is to maintain power. So they believe they dodged a bullet. They managed to survive. And of course, China continued to develop its economy in a way that the welfare of people in China really did dramatically improve over the next several decades. And so China remains a communist country with now a slowing economy. And as the previous speaker noted, typically when a country has serious domestic problems, they don't necessarily become more aggressive internationally. Most of the time, that's called the diversionary war hypothesis. Probably Ned Lebeau talked about that. Empirically, we don't find many cases like that. And certainly in the history of China, we find more cases of focusing on domestic problems when they have domestic problems rather than going out.
Xi Jinping and others, Chinese leaders, have talked about 100 years of humiliation, and that being an element of their current foreign policy. Would you like to talk about that?
Well, that's actually that framework of the period, the Qing dynasty, when China was internally divided under warlords, the economy was not developing very well, and the Western powers came in, and China was never colonized per se, but they had these ports, these concessions that were given over in and rural parts of China. Of course, the most humiliating part to the Chinese was what the Japanese did during World War II.
One more comment. So a question. It's my understanding that national security taxes or tariffs are allowed under the World Trade Organization, and I'm just wondering how that would fit in with your commentary about negotiating with China.
Yeah, the World Trade Organization is not going to help very much with restrictions on investment, human capital, the flows of people. The WTO never got there. You know, that was the plan. They were going to work on physical trade, products, manufacturing. They never actually even really got to agriculture. And they haven't gotten to technology and human capital and investment. So, and the WTO has been decimated by the United States and other countries so that it doesn't really have the authority. It doesn't have the authority to help us solve these problems, including, as you point out, sanctions and tariffs that are imposed for reasons of national security.
Our time is up. Thank you so very much, Professor Shirk. Just a reminder, each week's program is broadcast on KKFI roughly 1.5 weeks later. This presentation will likely air a week from Tuesday, March 26th, 7 to 8 p.m. Central on 90.1 FM. Or Professor Shirk, you can have your audience all around the world go to at that time to kkfi.org and click listen, or or they can go to Forum, search for the forum at All Souls Church YouTube channel at allsoulskc.org, or after 8 p.m. on March 26th, they can go to akfi.org, then News and Public Affairs, then All Souls Forum, and then look for your name. Find this episode. The podcast should be there shortly after the broadcast. Next week, Mark Hull will discuss the role of the media in conflict. Hull is an associate professor of military history at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'd love to hear from people who read the book and